If you look at any list of the greatest Spider-Man comics of all time, then Kraven's Last Hunter is going to be on there. But is it truly a timeless classic, or is it a bit overrated? Woof woof! Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Mad Dog, and we're back with another review. After you guys voted for it, we're going to be looking at Spider-Man Kraven's Last Hunt, which was written by DeMatteis, and it was illustrated by Mike Zeck. This 6-issue story came out between October and November of 1987, and if you're wondering why it managed to come out in such a short amount of time, it was because it took place across multiple issues of different Spider-Man titles. You had Webber's Spider-Man issue 31 and 32, Amazing Spider-Man 293 and 294, and the Spectacular Spider-Man issues 131 and 132. DeMatteis originally wanted the storyline to be for the little-known character Wonder Man, with the Grim Reaper taking the place of Kraven. When that idea was rejected, he took it across to DC, where he adapted the storyline so that the Joker would believe that he'd finally killed Batman. He wanted to explore the psychology of the character when the one person that the Joker looked towards to give him some kind of purpose in his life was no longer around. However, because of the fact that Alan Moore was already working on the Killing Joke, it was turned down yet again. This led to DeMatteis going back to Marvel, but instead of using Wonder Man, he this time wanted to use Spider-Man. He originally wanted to use a new villain so that he didn't mess up any of the continuity that was already going on, but as he began to develop the plot, he realised that he wanted to use Kraven the Hunter instead, and then that's how the story was born. But since its original release, this title's gained so much respect and gained so many accolades throughout the comics industry. But taking into account that the story came out at a time when comics were still considered to be for kids, and they hadn't really established themselves as a serialised media, is it possible that Kraven's Last Hunt only made as much of an impact as it did because of the time when it came out? Or is it the case that it still offers something that modern readers who are picking it up for the first time today can still find something to enjoy? That's going to be the question of this review. This is my TLDW. It's a part of the video for people who maybe don't have time to watch the full thing, but you still want to know if this book's for you. And if for whatever reason you're not able to read The Killing Joke, but you still want a story that looks at the complex relationship between a hero and a villain, then Kraven's Last Hunt may just be the best story that you might be able to find. But although the psychology of Kraven is explored to a much deeper extent than the Joker, the subplots can often take away from the main attraction. But for a relatively short and pretty much self-contained Spider-Man story, this deserves the majority of the praise that it's received in the 33 years since it debuted. If that's all the review that you needed, thank you for tuning in. Remember to click the thumbs up down below and the subscribe button next to it, along with the bell notifications so that you never miss a video. Kraven, after all of his years as a hunter, has decided that it's finally time for him to conquer the ultimate prey. Spider-Man. But the wall crawler's got his own problems that are going on at the moment. He's already in his cool black suit, which, let's be honest, is possibly the best Spider-Man suit of all time. He's quite newly married to Mary Jane, and he's just struggling to find balance in his life like pretty much any other Spider-Man story that goes on. But Kraven's adopting a ritual that he believes will make him become the Spider, so he eats them, he lives amongst them, he analyses the way that they think and the way that they move. And then finally, once he's completed this process, the moment is in front of him, he seizes it, and he believes that he has killed the Spider-Man. After burying the wall crawler in a scene that seems very reminiscent to the majority of the ending of most Spider-Man films, Kraven makes his own black costume and he patrols the streets. He is looking to make a point that he is better than Spider-Man, so he ends up fighting crime, but in a much more brutal fashion than what we're used to. With no one having an idea that there's an imposter running around in Peter's place, this attracts the attention of Mary Jane, who begins her own hunt to try and determine exactly what's going on beneath the mask. On top of all of this, Vermin has emerged once again, who's a villain that pretty much would have killed Spider-Man if it wasn't for the help of Captain America. This then makes Kraven realise that to complete his life goal of becoming the ultimate hunter, he must defeat that which his greatest enemy couldn't. But how can Spider-Man reclaim his legacy before it's tarnished forever? Will Mary Jane be able to overcome the fact that to be with Peter Parker, she must also learn to live with Spider-Man? And what does it mean for a life that's been focused around one goal that is now being conquered, and there's nothing left to accomplish? The art has a really nice pastel aspect to it that seems of its time and you don't really see too much now. It's a shame because I really like it and I feel like you get to actually see more of the detail of what's going on. And I know that obviously there's a massive hats off that needs to go to people like the inkers and the colorists because they also managed to bring that tone to it, but it's just something that you wouldn't really see in a modern comic now. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure if I read anything before that Mike Zeck had illustrated, but the style that it went for reminded me a lot of V for Vendetta. I'm not sure if that was an intentional motif that they were going for, if it was just something that reminded me personally, but for me me, I really think that this is a style that should get a lot more love. For some reason, it made everything feel like it had a lot more depth to it, and what they did in this that I like in a lot of comics is how they drew rain, and it seems like that might be something really weird to pick up on, and that maybe I didn't like the art overall, but I really did. But for me, the way that they did rain was just perfect. It was similar to what I saw in Daredevil by Frank Miller, and I just think I really liked the tone of art that was going on throughout this time. Because what I think this style allowed you to do was look at the human side of Kraven the Hunter, which was important for a story like this. What I really liked about this deluxe edition, and no, I'm not flexing at the fact that I've got it even though it's a little bit out of print, they did contain the first appearance of Kraven the Hunter in one of the Amazing Spider-Man issues. And you can see the difference in the styles right there. It had a lot more of a caricature aspect to it, whereas the Mike Zeck art really made you feel like Kraven was a person that had just completely lost who he was. He was so focused on his one goal, and you saw that in particular when he was amongst the spiders, and admittedly I'm a bit of an arachnophobic, like I probably shouldn't be saying that online, but for me that was something that really got under my skin, and you could almost feel as if you were there, but still it managed to give you enough that you felt that kind of claustrophobic sense of fear that was going on throughout the title. This might be a minor story for the book, but if you've seen some of the covers for it, you probably won't be anyway, but when Spider-Man was in the coffin, it also had that same sense of claustrophobia, and that was something that ran throughout the entire book. Even when you were in Kraven's manor, it felt like you were boxed in with the walls, and then when you were in the sewers, it felt the exact same way. They also touched on that personally in both Spider-Man's storyline and also in Vermin's storyline, so I think it was good that the art managed to reflect that. But this book did a good job straight from the beginning to give you a sense of tone within the book. I don't know why, but every time I read an 80s comic, I am expecting New York to just be covered in rain, for it to be quite grimy, to be quite dirty, but then when you read comics now, you don't expect that as much. But unfortunately, it does find itself in some points being trapped between being pretty much a Bronze Age title and also moving into that modern era. And what I mean by that is that the fights are kind of hit and miss. The first one with Kraven, and admittedly some of the end stuff with Kraven was really good, but pretty much all the scenes with Vermin and all the fights that were going on there just weren't really enjoyable, weren't too dynamic, and I think that they could have done a bit more. And for some reason, we followed the inner monologue of 4 different characters, and 2 of them have very similar thought bubble colours. But because of the filmic aspect that the art brought to this title, and the way that light and shadow was used, and the way that some of the paneling was expressed in a different way, even if it didn't really go that extra mile where I think it could have done, I think you won't be too disappointed with what you get in this book. The first thing that really took me by surprise when I was reading this book was the great sense of horror that carried through it, and how this made it feel different from pretty much every other Spider-Man story that I've ever read. But it's really hard not to compare this book to The Killing Joke, considering the fact that they turned the spotlight onto the villain for once, and the fact that they came out at similar times. But when I did manage to separate myself from comparing those 2 books, I appreciated just how much this did for a Spider-Man story. I've tried reading Silver Age Spider-Man before, I even tried reading the Kraven's First Hunt that was in this book, and for a modern reader like myself, sometimes it does come across as being quite clunky, even if I can appreciate what it was trying to do at the time. And that untraditional approach of telling a Spider-Man story through the lens of a horror movie was what really set it apart for me personally. I also love the psychology of Kraven, because I haven't really ever seen too much of him. I think my first introduction to him was probably the Ultimate Universe, but I imagine as well this might also be the introduction to Kraven for most people, so I like that it really delved deep into who he is as a character, what exactly it was that motivated him, and why he was going after this goal of pursuing Spider-Man. This made me want Kraven the Hunter to be the villain in an upcoming Spider-Man film. I know that we've had rumours, but can you imagine if they did Kraven the Hunter with the same level of depth that they did with Killmonger and Black Panther? I think as well, all major villains should probably have at least one of these type stories that really defines who they are as a character. Because before I read this, I was thinking to myself, who are Spider-Man's main villains? I always try to ask myself questions like that before I actually jump into a book. But Kraven wasn't really mixing it with any of those, but now that I've read this story, I would put him quite close to the top of that list. I'm talking a lot about Kraven, and primarily it is a Kraven story more than a Spider-Man one, but they do still present the Wallcrawler in a great way. There's this scene at the beginning where they show Peter Parker's compassion still coming through despite the fact that he's in the Spider-Man getup. And at the beginning I didn't really get why they were doing this, but then all of a sudden when you see Kraven in the costume, you understand that it's to compare that contrast between the two. And it's quite interesting because of the fact that the lesson of Into the Spider-Verse is that anybody can be Spider-Man, but I feel like this story reminded us exactly why Peter Parker is the best Spider-Man. He is the person who still cares, and even when he's rounding up criminals, he still cares about the safety of those people. And it developed in a really interesting way, and I like that they explored the anger that Peter was feeling throughout the book. I kind of took it that that was a side effect of the symbiote. I'm not sure if that was intentional, but still it explored the way that the villains have an impact on the hero. This also sort of resonated with Vermin because of the fact that he hadn't been able to defeat him previously on his own, and then in this book, at the point where those two met once again, it was as if Peter Parker had some kind of like mission, some vendetta that he couldn't fail at again. Admittedly though, it was quite useful that this deluxe edition does include the issue where Vermin appeared and Spider-Man had to use Captain America to help him defeat him. But it's also more like this seesaw effect, that the more calm and sort of content that Kraven became throughout this book, Peter Parker ended up becoming more angry and more determined. Unfortunately though, I did feel like this was a victim to an 80s style of writing. I know that's a weird criticism, but if I'm looking at this as a story that I could be recommending to people who've never read it before, it's something that I do have to consider. It's not as bad as Silver Age, where they will literally retell you the origin of Spider-Man in absolutely every single panel, but it still hasn't found that perfect balance between showing and telling. And I think because of the fact that Mike Zeck had this really interesting and unique style of art that I hadn't really seen in many other places, I wanted to just showcase more of that. I don't need to know the inner thinkings of absolutely every single character every time they decide to walk down the street. And that ties into my next criticism, which is the fact that the Mary Jane and Vermin subplots do really slow down this story. Going back to the unfair comparison, that's the one thing that the Killing Joke didn't have to deal with. Because of the fact that it was one issue, it did just get on with the story that it was trying to tell you. It didn't have to bog you down with, oh, is Mary Jane wondering if Peter's ever going to come home? Like, I can assume that she's worried. I'd be more interested in a storyline where she wasn't concerned about Peter's safety. And Vermin wasn't an interesting enough villain to me, and he ended up becoming a pawn just in Kraven's game, so why do I need to hear his inner monologue? It was fun in the first few instances because of the fact that you heard his feral thinking and the way that that was articulated, but after that I was just like, get on with the main story. As well, if you only read the base 6 issues of this story, I think that you actually miss out on the most interesting part of it. There's a few issues that followed up, and you saw Peter's reaction to the finale of Kraven's Last Hunt, which admittedly I can't spoil here, and seeing that reaction to the situation and the fact that he was still going through this trauma because of the fact that he was buried alive were the most interesting parts about this book. I'm not sure if I can really criticise the main story because of that, but I feel like you would be missing the end part of it if you didn't get those extra issues. I'm really glad that they did make the decision to not base a story entirely on a new villain, and they did actually give it to Kraven. Give a spotlight to a hero that hasn't really been seen before in a similar way that Batman did with Mr. Freeze. And this is one of those stories that makes you go back and look at Kraven in a different light. Even when I look at the ultimate version of Kraven now, I've always got Kraven's Last Hunt in the back of my head. This is your last warning in case somehow like me you'd managed to avoid spoilers for this book for the 33 years since it'd been published. Kraven's suicide really caught me by surprise. I knew that there was some kind of big punch at the ending, and I thought that maybe Kraven might die, but I thought it might be at the hands of Spider-Man, but for him to kill himself just messed with me a little bit. And again, I'm sorry to keep comparing it to The Killing Joke, but I think that the ending was the one thing where they managed to best DC. I'm gonna do a Killing Joke video at some point in the future, let me know if you want to see that sooner rather than later, but I think that the way that they handled this and that they made it so definitive was something that DC didn't manage to do. And although it was unexpected, I'm not saying it's bad, I actually think that it was a really good turn for the story because it looked at the relationship between hero and villain in a way that not many other stories do. It was actually quite heartbreaking to learn that Kraven only really continued to exist because of the fact that he hadn't managed to defeat Spider-Man, and that once that was done, once that part of his journey was over, that he just saw that there was no more life to live. Pretty intense stuff, and I imagine that when it did come out, it really struck a chord with a lot of people, because that question does always crop up, that does the villain exist because the superhero existed first, or is it the other way round? And I think this just added a different level to it, that there's some kind of purpose in the same way that Spider-Man feels that he's got this responsibility because of the fact that he's got this power. Kraven in the same way feels like he's got a responsibility because of the fact that he's got to prove himself. He also touched on the heritage of Kraven and the reason why he was so determined to accomplish this goal because of the fact that his parents were run out of their country. I loved that extra level of depth to this character, and it felt like a story that was a little bit different than the normal villain origin that you often get. But the whole storyline with Vermin didn't need to be introduced as early as it was, or it didn't need to have as much focus as it took from the main story. If anything, I feel like Vermin had more of this story than Peter did. Like, I get that they're trying to create a contrast between a villain that's got a mission and a villain that's got an impulse. I was perfectly content with just following Kraven. I wasn't ever reading it and being like, I wish we could just look at another villain now. Kraven was the most interesting part of this story. There's a reason why it's called Kraven's Last Hunt and not Vermin's Last Hunt, because of the fact that Vermin was just there. He wasn't an interesting villain. Same with the Mary Jane part. This could have just been a few pages. Actually, it probably could have just been a few panels. I'm not sure if I'm in the minority here, but I can't imagine that many people read this Spider-Man story because of the fact that they want to see Mary Jane looking for Peter Parker. Well, in that same sense where we're talking about pacing, I do have to give this a lot of respect because of the fact that they allowed Spider-Man to be buried for a significant amount of time. That commitment to this aspect of the story really showed that they were determined to just tell a story about Kraven, so that's why it confused me a lot that we were focused on Vermin and Mary Jane at the same time. And I can't deny that Spider-Man being buried gave us one of the greatest comic book covers of all time. I just really love this one. There was also a lot of literary references in this that I really appreciated, and I also couldn't help drawing a lot of parallels between Kraven in his manor and Bruce Wayne when he's in his mansion. Like when he's not angry, if you take the mustache off him, he pretty much does look like Bruce Wayne. And I never really use this phrase, but this story was genuinely ahead of its time, and I feel like it was actually hindered by the time when it came out. Because of some of those issues with the storytelling aspects, I feel like if this would have been remade and have it over the 3 issues and trim out the majority of Vermin and Mary Jane and have 1 issue for Death, another for Kraven imposing as Spider-Man, and the last issue being the final conflict, then I think that this would have truly been as great as I hear most people saying it is. But unfortunately for myself as a modern reader who doesn't have the nostalgia for this story and didn't read it at the time when it was coming out so that I could really appreciate just how groundbreaking this was, I do feel that it does fall a little bit short. My final verdict is that Kraven's Last Hunt deserves the respect that it's got for all the years since it's been published, but that doesn't mean that it's without fault. Often with these storylines that are still remembered decades after they originally came out, they can get this mythic status, that belief that they're so perfect that they can't do anything wrong, and I feel like unfortunately Kraven's Last Hunt has fallen into that bracket. And I say unfortunately because there's still a great story here at its core. I say this in most of my reviews, but I represent the common, kind of stupid reader. I'm not gonna understand the deeper context and everything, I'm gonna miss out on some of the finer details. But Kraven's Last Hunt genuinely does strike me as one of those stories that will get better on repeated readings. So who knows, maybe a few years from now you're gonna see a second video where I re-review this and maybe my answer will change. But for the modern reader, I think there is still a lot here to enjoy, even if it is still stuck in a lot of the tropes that were affecting other comics in general around that time. You get a really unique art style that you won't see in other titles and you probably won't see in general nowadays. And you get a story that is bogged down by its subplots, but the main plot has a really complex way of looking at the delicate relationship between hero and villain. It has a really bittersweet ending, it's got great horror vibes throughout, and it also tells a Spider-Man story that you won't see in many other comics. Although I do think that you need some of the follow-up issues that are contained in this deluxe edition, I still think that you're getting enough story here that most people can enjoy, and because of the fact that it's only 6 issues, it's not going to take too much of your time. Because of the fact that I feel like I'd enjoy this more on repeat readings, I do have to actually change my rating system, so now we're just going to go with a percentage. So for me this got a very modest 65%. Woof woof! That's all it really gets, that's 65% of the woof woof. But that's my review and I'm looking forward to talking to other people, especially if you've read this at the time or more than once. So leave your thoughts in the comment section below, give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and if you didn't, why did you get this far? If you stuck around this long, my next review is going to be Batman and Robin by Peter J. Tomasi. Here are some of my other videos that you might want to watch, but until next time, just make sure that you stay safe, stay reading the best books that you can find, and stay mad all you dogs. Woof woof! See you at the next video.